Have you ever been lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering, why are we here? What's the point of it all? These questions can hit you out of nowhere, leaving you feeling lost and unsure about life. Now imagine this. You've achieved everything you thought would make you happy. Money, fame, a loving family. But one day it all feels empty, like none of it really matters. What would you do? How would you find meaning again? This is the story of Leo Tolstoy, a man who had it all but still felt lost. Born in 1828 in Russia, Tolstoy became one of the greatest writers of all time, famous for books like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. His work changed literature forever, but at 50 years old he hit a breaking point. On the outside, his life looked perfect. He was rich, respected, and loved. But on the inside, he felt empty. He started questioning everything. His success, his writing, even his family. None of it felt meaningful anymore. Life felt like a never-ending cycle of confusion and despair. He couldn't find a way out. But here's the good part. Tolstoy didn't give up. His struggle led him to discover deep truths about life and purpose. Lessons that can help us when we feel lost or stuck. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand Tolstoy's story, but also learn how to apply his insights to your own life. You'll walk away with simple, practical ways to find meaning, even when life feels overwhelming. So if you've ever felt lost, empty, or unsure about your purpose, this story is for you. Tolstoy's journey shows us that even in our darkest moments, there's hope. Let's dive in and see how he found his way back, and how you can too. The most shocking part of all this is that this crisis didn't come in his young age, when downfall is common, but rather in his maturity, when one would expect someone to have already found answers. Tolstoy had spent nearly 5 decades living without deep philosophical unease, so why suddenly did everything change? He asked himself this very question, but instead of finding a solution, he was sucked into an even deeper abyss. The more he tried to escape, the more reality showed him there was nowhere to run. From that moment on, his search for meaning became intense, but also painful. To understand how Tolstoy reached this point, we need to go back in time and look at his youth, marked by loss, questioning, and a conflicted relationship with faith. Before becoming one of the greatest writers in history, Tolstoy was just a boy who learned early on the meaning of loss. As a young man, he saw his parents pass away, leaving a wound that never fully healed. Death, which for many children seems like a distant idea, became a constant presence in his life. While other children ran free, he was already asking, if everyone dies, what's the point of being here? This doubt, which would later become an obsession, began to form long before fame and wealth. Religion, which should have been a refuge, didn't bring the comfort he expected. On the contrary, it only deepened his doubts. Raised within the traditions of Russian Orthodox Christianity, he observed the rituals and sermons, but something there didn't make sense. He saw priests preaching humility while bathing in luxury, speaking of love while judging sinners with disdain. How could he believe in something that seemed so disconnected from reality? The faith presented to him didn't answer his questions. It only added more layers to his skepticism. Tolstoy expressed this feeling clearly when he wrote, "The Christian doctrine was taught to me from childhood, but when I reached the age of reason, I realized it couldn't withstand the knowledge and experience of life." For him, it wasn't the idea of God that was wrong, but rather the way religion was practiced. While searching for answers, he saw that what was taught in churches was often a performance, where beautiful words hid an uncomfortable truth. No one truly knew the meaning of life. Without a solid foundation in faith and carrying the pain of losing his parents, Tolstoy took a different path. He sought meaning in literature, philosophy, and even military life. During his youth, he tried to fill the void with intense experiences. He gambled, drank, and lived fleeting passions. But deep down, he knew these distractions were just temporary fixes. Like many who try to escape existential discomfort, he realized that no matter how fast he ran, the anguish always caught up to him. And so he grew up with this latent restlessness, unaware that decades later, this lack of answers would become a storm that would bring him to the brink of despair. What happened when this crisis hit him? That's where the story becomes even more intense. Tolstoy lived nearly 50 years without worrying about deep existential questions. He wrote, enjoyed success, traveled, had a loving family. In short, he lived a life anyone would consider fulfilling. But all of this began to crumble silently, gradually. He realized that the glow of fame didn't illuminate his soul. What was once pleasurable began to feel trivial. Every book published, every compliment received, every achievement reached only reinforced the feeling that none of it had real meaning. It was as if suddenly the ground beneath his feet had disappeared. He himself described this feeling in a confession, one of his most anguishing texts. Tolstoy said he felt as if he were being dragged into a bottomless pit, where the only thing that made sense was the thought of ending his life. Each day lived carried an immense weight, each night a temporary relief. Sleep was his only escape from the anguish. But what about when he woke up? Everything returned. The same emptiness, the same fear, the same relentless question hammering his mind. Why go on? He was convinced there was no way out except to give up on everything. If his own life no longer had meaning, why would anyone else's? He sought answers in books, in thinkers, in logic, but nothing filled that void. The irony? This was a man who had spent his life writing stories about human dilemmas, who had delved into the psyche of his characters with mastery, but who now found himself unable to understand himself. The same brilliant mind that created War and Peace was now dragging him into a labyrinth of anguish with no exit. And how do you escape suffering that isn't physical but existential? Tolstoy experienced a form of despair that few dare to face. It wasn't just sadness. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was a profound terror at the realization that, in the end, everything might just be a great nothingness. If the world was indifferent, if death was inevitable, if time swallowed everything, then why go on? He felt he needed to find an answer, or he wouldn't be able to keep living. This was how Tolstoy began his frantic search for meaning. If the happiness he knew was nothing but an illusion, he needed to find something real. But the more he searched, the more questions arose, and as he tried to solve this impossible equation, he found himself trapped in a cycle of questioning that seemed endless. He wasn't an ordinary man facing a crisis. While many tried to ignore existential doubts, he went deep, investigating each one with surgical precision. But the problem was, the more he tried to find answers, the more questions emerged. With every reflection on life, death, and time, new paradoxes presented themselves. He felt trapped in an infinite cycle. If I live but everything ends in death, then what's the purpose of it all? And if there were a purpose, why did no one seem to know what it was? His novel Anna Karenina reflects this anguish through the character Levin, a man who, like Tolstoy, desperately seeks meaning for existence. Levin oscillates between moments of hope and despair, trying to find logic where perhaps there is none. Tolstoy used his characters as mirrors of his own mind, and in this case, the mirror reflected someone who couldn't escape their own consciousness. He described his frustration with cutting words. The question that most clearly posed the problem of the meaning of life to me was this: what will happen to what I do today and tomorrow? What will happen to my entire life? The answer was, nothing. You will be forgotten, and everything you do will be meaningless. These words echo what many feel in silence. After all, isn't that the greatest fear of all? To live an entire life and, in the end, realize it was all in vain? The worst part was the inability to escape this thought. He could distract himself with work, family, or even his readings. But the emptiness always returned when his mind fell silent. It's like when you try not to think about something, and suddenly it becomes the only thing on your mind. There was no escape, no respite, just a cycle that repeated itself mercilessly. Tolstoy needed a new path. If he couldn't find answers in traditional philosophy, where could he look? It was at this moment that an old story began to resonate in his mind, a parable that perfectly captured his own existence. The story of a man trapped between the fear of death and the momentary distraction of life's pleasures. Imagine a man running desperately, fleeing a wild beast thirsty for his flesh. In his attempt to escape, he comes across a deep well, and without a second thought jumps in. But he soon realizes the danger isn't over. At the bottom of the well, a dragon waits with its mouth open, ready to devour him. At the last moment, he clings to the roots of a tree growing on the side of the well. Suspended between two fatal destinies, he notices something even worse. Two small creatures, a white mouse and a black mouse, begin gnawing at the roots holding him up. In this desperate scenario, he finds a distraction. A few drops of honey drip from nearby leaves, and he sticks out his tongue to taste them. For a moment, he forgets about the beast above, the dragon below, and the inevitable fall. The sweet taste of the honey is enough to make him forget, even if just for an instant, the tragedy awaiting him. But what does this story really mean? For Tolstoy, this tale summed up the human condition. The wild beast represented birth, the dragon was death, and the mice, one white, one black, symbolized the days and nights slowly eroding life. The question tormenting him was clear. Is it worth distracting ourselves with honey when we know that inevitably we will fall? This explained his frustration with life. People sought pleasures, accumulated wealth, built relationships, but all of it was just small drops of honey. Time continued to gnaw at the rope, and sooner or later the dragon would swallow us. For someone who desired a greater meaning for existence, this realization was a devastating blow. Tolstoy saw this parable as a cruel metaphor for what he felt. He tried to deceive himself with life's pleasures, success, writing, recognition. But deep down, he knew the dragon was waiting. He couldn't be content with distractions because he understood they were only temporary anesthetics. For many, living this way might be enough, but for him, it wasn't. If everything was just a matter of time before the fall, then there were only two options: accept the emptiness or find real meaning, something greater than the small, fleeting pleasures of life. But where could he look for this answer? Religion no longer served him, and the literature he loved so much didn't fill the void. Perhaps philosophy and science held some answers, and that's exactly where he turned his attention in a frantic search for something that could save him from the abyss opening before him. Tolstoy wasn't the kind of man to accept ignorance as an answer. If religion failed to give him meaning, and life's pleasures were only temporary distractions, then maybe philosophy could illuminate the path. He immersed himself in the works of thinkers like Solomon, Socrates, and Buddha, figures who had dedicated their lives to understanding the deepest questions of existence. The mystery of existence had consumed Tolstoy, but to his frustration, the conclusion always seemed the same. Life was a cycle without a defined purpose, and the only certainty was death. What to do with this truth? He realized that throughout history, the wise had arrived at a devastating answer. It would be better never to have been born. Socrates himself, accepting death with serenity, demonstrated that perhaps the only real liberation was the end of life. Solomon, with all his wisdom, summed it up with the phrase, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And Buddha, speaking of the inherent suffering of life, pointed out that the only way out was to completely detach from existence. Tolstoy had hoped philosophy would bring comfort, but instead he found a dead end. If philosophers didn't offer satisfying answers, perhaps science could fill this void. The problem? Science seemed only to reinforce his sense of insignificance. Darwinism, which was on the rise at the time, portrayed life as a biological accident. Humans weren't special, just another species struggling to survive, shaped by time and environment. There was no grand purpose, no hidden meaning. The universe simply existed, indifferent to human pain and hope. For someone tormented by the need to find meaning, this answer was terrifying. If everything was just a mechanism without intention, then what was left? Tolstoy felt that rationality was leading him to an even greater abyss. Knowledge didn't offer him peace. On the contrary, it deepened his anguish. He was beginning to understand why so many people preferred simply not to think about it. And that's when he realized something intriguing. While he was writhing in despair, many around him seemed to live their lives without this crushing weight. But how? What were these people doing differently? He began to observe and catalog the different ways people dealt with the lack of meaning in life, and it was then that he came to a surprising conclusion. He began to analyze how the people around him faced the question of life's meaning. He noticed that most didn't even allow themselves to reflect on it. Others gave themselves over to pleasure-seeking distractions to avoid the discomfort of existential emptiness. Some chose the most tragic path, while others simply kept living without much resistance. After much observation, he classified these reactions into 4 categories. The first was ignorance of the existential question. Many people simply avoided thinking about the meaning of life. They stayed busy, wrapped up in work and daily obligations, and never stopped to reflect on what they were really doing. Tolstoy saw this as a kind of anesthesia. He realized that these people rarely entered into crisis because they never allowed themselves to confront the difficult questions. Interestingly, this view resembles the thinking of Albert Camus, who argued that most people live as if life has a purpose, even without proof of it. The second group was made up of those who sought pleasure to avoid suffering. Tolstoy compared these people to those licking the drops of honey in the well metaphor. They knew death was inevitable, but chose to distract themselves while they could. They sought money, relationships, parties, entertainment, anything to keep their minds occupied. The problem? Like any anesthetic, the effects of pleasure always wore off, and when that happened, the anguish returned with a vengeance. Tolstoy saw this as a temporary but unsustainable solution. The third response was to take one's own life. For those who understood the lack of meaning in life and saw no way out, this seemed to be the only way to solve the problem. Tolstoy didn't ignore this possibility. On the contrary, he himself was tormented by these thoughts. But throughout his search, he found reasons not to go down this path. He wanted those facing existential crisis to understand that no matter how dark life seemed, there was always a chance to find something greater. That's why he argued that it was necessary to keep searching for answers rather than giving up. The fourth group was the most intriguing to him. These were the people who recognized the lack of meaning in life, but simply kept living, resigned. They didn't give themselves over to pleasure or ignorance, but they also didn't seek answers. They simply accepted reality as it was and moved forward. For Tolstoy, this was the weakest state of all. There was neither rebellion nor enthusiasm, just an emotional weariness that kept them trapped in an empty existence. Faced with these 4 reactions, Tolstoy felt compelled to choose a path. He knew he couldn't ignore the question, nor could he live solely on momentary pleasures. Taking his own life wasn't an option, but he also didn't want to merely survive without purpose. And it was in this dilemma that he began to notice something surprising. While he, a wealthy and cultured man, wrestled with these questions, much humbler people seemed to find peace and meaning in life. How was this possible? It was by observing the peasants that he began to perceive an answer that had previously seemed impossible to accept. He saw that these people, who lived with so little, carried an unshakable faith. They didn't question the meaning of life as he did. They didn't need grand philosophical theories or rational explanations to keep living. They simply believed, and that was enough for them. Tolstoy was fascinated by this discovery. These men and women, without education, without possessions, without any material guarantees, seemed to live with more serenity than he, a man who had everything. While he sank into anguish, they demonstrated an unshakable strength. They sang, laughed, worked hard, faced difficulties, and yet maintained a peace he had never experienced. What made them so different? It was then that he realized faith wasn't an intellectual concept. It wasn't something explained in books or proven with arguments. It was something lived. The peasants didn't need proof of God's existence. For them, the simple fact of being alive and facing their daily struggles was already a demonstration that life had meaning. Tolstoy, who had always sought answers through reason, found himself faced with something that couldn't be understood solely through logic. He began to ask himself, what if the mistake was in the search itself? What if the answer wasn't in philosophy or science, but in something deeper, something that could only be felt and not explained? This idea began to shift his perspective. For the first time, he saw faith not as a set of dogmas imposed by the church, but as a force that allowed people to keep living even in the face of difficulties and the unknown. From that moment on, Tolstoy began a painful but transformative transition. He, who had always trusted reason above all else, now found himself forced to consider something he had previously despised: the possibility that faith, not logic, might be the only real answer to the existential dilemma. But this change wasn't simple. His rational side resisted. His mind wrestled with it. How could he reconcile everything he had learned with this new perspective. It was an internal conflict that consumed him. But gradually, he began to realize that perhaps faith wasn't the opposite of reason, but rather what completed it. Tolstoy had always believed that reason was the key to understanding life. He had spent decades trying to find answers through logic, but all he had achieved was an even greater emptiness. Now, observing the simple faith of the people, he began to notice something he had always ignored. Reason can be powerful, but it has limits. The problem was that accepting this felt like betraying everything he had believed in until then. How could a man who had built his life on intellectuality now surrender to something that couldn't be proven? But the more he resisted, the more he realized that his own intelligence had become a prison. He didn't want to simply believe in something irrational, but he also couldn't deny the effect faith had on the lives of the people around him. While he suffered with unanswered questions, those people lived in peace. They weren't anesthetized. They weren't ignoring reality. They simply saw life differently. And Tolstoy began to ask himself, what if the mistake isn't in them, but in me? It was a painful change because it required him to set aside his intellectual pride and admit that perhaps he had been looking in the wrong place for years. He had rejected faith because he saw it as an illusion. Now he began to understand that perhaps the illusion was believing that reason could provide all the answers. He realized that life wasn't just a logical problem to be solved. It was something that needed to be lived, with all its contradictions and mysteries. But this transition didn't happen overnight. He fought against this idea, questioned it, doubted it, resisted it. Yet every time he tried to refute faith, he realized it filled a space that nothing else could occupy. For the first time, he saw that perhaps the answer wasn't in understanding life, but in accepting it, and that the meaning he had been searching for wouldn't come from the mind, but from the heart. He didn't become religious in the traditional sense. He remained critical of ecclesiastical institutions, but now he saw faith as something personal, intimate, a direct connection to what truly mattered. He finally found a way out of despair, but this new worldview would change everything in his life. He couldn't continue living the same way. His new understanding would lead him down an unexpected path, one that would completely transform his final years. After his transformation, Tolstoy could no longer live as he had before. Luxury and comfort began to seem like unnecessary excesses. He, who had once been a respected nobleman, began to reject his social position. He wanted to live a simpler life, closer to the ordinary people he so admired. Gradually, he gave up material possessions, began wearing humble clothes, and even tried working in the fields like the peasants who had inspired his change. But this new worldview created conflicts. His family, especially his wife, didn't understand this transformation. To them, Tolstoy was going too far. He wanted to donate his properties, share his earnings, and live like a simple man. But his wife, who had always supported him, couldn't accept seeing everything they had built being discarded. This family tension became a heavy burden in his final years, and he found himself torn between what he believed and what his family expected of him. Even so, he stayed true to his new philosophy. He wrote essays on nonviolence, inspiring figures like Gandhi. He preached love for one's neighbor, humility, and simplicity as the true values of life. To many, he was no longer just a writer. He was almost a prophet, someone who had lived through existential despair and found an answer. But deep down, his internal struggle continued. The transition from reason to faith was never complete. He still carried doubts, still questioned himself. But now, instead of seeing them as a burden, he learned to accept them as a part of the human experience. At the end of his life, Tolstoy made a radical decision. At 82 years old, unable to bear the conflicts at home, he fled from his own family. He left alone, with no clear destination, seeking the peace he had never fully found. But his body was already weak. Just a few days later, he fell ill and passed away on November 20th, 1910, in a small train station, surrounded by strangers. For a man who spent his life trying to understand the meaning of existence, it was perhaps a symbolic end. Without wealth, without pomp, just him and the silence. But his legacy lived on. Tolstoy left us much more than books. He left proof that the meaning of life isn't something found in words, but in how we choose to live it. His search for answers may never have reached a definitive conclusion, but it taught us something valuable. It's in the search itself that we find meaning. And perhaps that's the only answer that truly matters.